Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about traditional game mechanics and what I tried to do in video games based on those mechanics. This comes from a question from Shearsner, who asked, I know you've made a video game about board games that have influenced you, but I was wondering, since you mentioned reactivity, multiple solution puzzles, and roleplay as defining elements of your games, as you said it yourself, all stem back to traditional TTRPG design choices. Obviously, D&D being our biggest reference. So what other elements of traditional gaming, i.e. non-digital formats such as board games, have influenced your design philosophy and style? Was it a conscious decision to implement them into your games, or would you try to distance video games from traditional gaming? Finally, what other elements have you liked to experiment and transpose to video games throughout your career, but you couldn't figure out a way to do it? Good question. I've touched upon those here and there in other videos. So I think you're going to see me giving references a lot, but I will try to summarize them. But as always, if I say I have a video for it, probably goes into a lot more detail on that particular topic than I'll do here. Because I have talked about, as Shearsner mentioned, the influences of tabletop games on my video games. There's a video for that. Then, because people asked specifically about D&D and all the different versions, I did a separate video about that, which is how each version you can kind of see influences from it in my games. But I've also talked about writing my own tabletop role-playing game and what I would try to do and what I wouldn't, which is kind of like my video game stuff going back to influence a tabletop design. I've also talked about adapting tabletop RPGs into video games, which is its own thing. So I'm going to assume you watched all those videos. I may bring them up and touch upon things I've mentioned, but I'm not going to go as in depth. So let me talk about traditional game mechanics that I saw in tabletop games, board games, card games, and stuff that I tried using. I'm going to break it up into three things. I'm going to talk about what I actually ended up using in some of my games. I'm going to talk about some that I just avoided. I was like, it works great on the tabletop. I don't want to do that in a video game. And then I'll talk about a few that I tried but could never quite figure out how to do it and still maintain my POV and my design pillars and things like that. So let's talk about first. I'll start with a few things that I saw in traditional games and I wanted something like that in my game. The first one would be how cards display information. If you've played Fallout and you've seen those perk cards and skill cards, it's down there in something we call the skill dex, which was spelled DEX like dexterity, but it was really just a shortened form of a DECKS. Like, here's the deck of cards. Those were straight out of board games. In fact, Leonard Boyarsky, who drew the first Vault Boy, said that was based on Mr. Moneybags from Monopoly. It was kind of that kind of thematic game mascot. And then those cards were like the Monopoly cards, where it told you something that you could do, some skill effect, some perk effect, and then it had a funny little cartoon of Vault Boy experiencing that situation. Similarly, I played a lot of games, tabletop RPGs, and a few board games that had critical failures, that you could roll so badly that something bad happened. And I put that into both Fallout and Arcanum. When I played D&D, and I played AD&D or D&D version 1, whatever you want to call it, when I played that in high school, they didn't have critical success or failure, but I wanted them so much that I ended up adding my own homebrew system, and then a really cool system came out. I think it was in Dragon Magazine. I ended up using that. And what it was, whenever you succeeded, there was a percent chance that you would critically succeed, and whenever you failed, there was a percent chance that you would critically fail. And the percent was based on how far above or below the roll you rolled. Love those things. I put it in Fallout and Arcanum. A lot of people don't like it. I know people will restart Fallout if they critically fail too often at the beginning. Some people were put off from playing Fallout because they critically failed. And same thing happened in Arcanum. It's why Fallout has a hidden some hidden code I put in it that prevents critical failures for the first game day. because I just didn't want to discourage people from playing. And I've talked about maybe Fallout needed a setting to just turn those off. Because on tabletop, when you do the roll, you accept it. When the game rolls for you, you don't accept it. But I talk about dice and things I stayed away from. But one last thing was, a lot of tabletop games had the ability for you, the player, to override a roll. Any board game, when you get to a vague rule, you can talk to the other players and maybe not say, oh, that doesn't apply to me. When I played the tabletop RPG called Torg, it had these things called possibility points that you were awarded for doing amazing things during role-playing. And you could use those to override the DM. You roll something and you missed, and you go, no, possibility point, I hit. Or you hit and you go, and now it's a crit. Those were the direct inspiration for fate points in Arcanum. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I have been influenced by board and other tabletop games and brought those elements into my own RPGs. But now let me talk about some things that I stayed away from. Or tried to stay away from. Because the first one I'm going to talk about is character creation randomness. I like making every part of your player character. I like you being able to name it. I like you being able to pick a background. I like you being able to pick a gender. I like you to be able to pick all your attributes and skills and perks and whatever it is for you to have. Now, you can't just let people buy them all up to max or have them all at max. So I usually put some kind of point buying system in. I don't like randomness, because I used it in one game, Temple, because that's how D&D worked. You rolled dice for your character. And we just put a reroll button in there because we knew if people started the game and they didn't get a good character, they'd just restart the game. So we tried to make it easy on you and just say, okay, here's a reroll button. Plus, we also put in Cutie in there. If you rerolled, I think it's 100 times, it makes a comment like, whoa, you rerolled 100 times. You're hardcore. But in general, I like to stay away from character creation randomness. Because for me, it's as bad as not being able to create your character at all. I've also stayed away from builds that use cards. We used cards as a display element in Fallout, but I'm talking about games where your build is you're randomly dealt abilities from a deck of cards. Or when you're playing the game, it gives you a card to do things. I have a video about deck builders. I like them. I didn't want that in my RPG. Again, it's a source of randomness that in a tabletop game that works. In a computer game, you can do better than that. Similarly with dice, and I'm going to preface this with, don't get me wrong, I love Baldur's Gate 3. But in general, I don't like my role-playing games to actually have simulations of physical dice that roll. Because, and don't get me wrong, I like dice, but I prefer usually bigger ranges than you can have, D20, even D100. And also exposing the rolls, having what looks like a physical model roll, it feels a bit like a gimmick if your game isn't a dice-themed game. So if you're making a Yahtzee game, knock yourself out. But if you're making a role-playing game, I steered clear of saying, let's simulate the dice roll physically. Let's model it in the game. Other things I tried to stay away from is, and this is going to be the opposite, these are things I avoided because tabletop games did them better. And that is, I tried not to think about, I've got to simplify this mechanic so a human can do it. It's why I stay away from cards and dice rolling, because I don't mind a lot of bonuses. I don't mind unusual ranges of rolls with lots of bonuses coming in with all kinds of stacking rules, like you only take the highest one, or you add them together, or it's a percentage of the additional ones. As long as humans can understand them, I don't mind if it's tedious for them to compute them by hand, because the computer's doing it. You understand the rules. It's like, I understand I have 15 different bonuses that factor in. It's only going to take the highest, and those bonuses can fluctuate based on time of day and my fatigue level and all that. You understand it. The fact that calculating that by hand and keeping track of it on a character sheet, don't have to worry about that. So I try not to simplify rules so that humans can use them. I just try to simplify it so humans can understand them. The base rule here is, if I've never made one of my design pillars be, let's simplify this rule so eventually a board or card game version can be made of this game. That is not a priority for me. So that's what things I stay away from board and tabletop games. Now let's dive into the other part of this, which is what have I tried that didn't work out? If you've watched this channel or you played Outer Worlds, you know that I was trying to get something like flaws working for decades. Because Fallout had traits, which was a good thing glued to a bad thing, but that was the only way you could get that in there. So what I wanted specifically for flaws was a negative thing that you gained after character creation. Preferably you could choose it. Now I have a whole video about the evolution of flaws and what I had to go through to eventually come up with a video game that had a really cool flaw mechanic. But there are other things that I have tried for decades and never could quite figure out. One of them is non-numerical role-playing game attributes. There have been a lot of tabletop RPGs that have done this. Or I should say, it exists. And they're old. Amber diceless. You don't have a strength. You get points, you bid on it, and if you win, you are the strongest character. Nobody's stronger than you. Same thing for all the other attributes. It's interesting. I did a talk at Reboot, and I'll link the video below, where I talk about using triangles to represent different attributes on the character. And by rotating this simple geometric shape, people will know, well, I'm either really strong but not very dexterous, or I'm pretty good at strength and dexterity, but then my constitution is really, really bad. It allows you to make a character that isn't great at everything, but it's very easy for people to understand shapes. A lot of people understand shapes way better than they understand numbers. Never could figure out how to get that working well in a game. Some other things that I've never been able to do. Other games have done it. I'm not super happy with their implementation. One of them is insanity. I wanted to make a game once where the character literally saw the world differently than it was. Because either they were insane or they had experienced some kind of severe trauma, but they were seeing the world differently than the world actually was. And then there were points in the game where you would actually see it for what it was. Maybe when your health was low, maybe if you died as you fell over, it melted and you saw the world for what it really was. Or maybe there was some form of telepathy and you see the world through someone else's eyes. And you're like, oh my God, what am I seeing? What do I see? Never could figure out how to get that work. And usually artists would yell at me saying, I'm not making twice as much art for everything you want to do. And then the last thing I could never quite figure out is random backgrounds, powers, effects. This isn't like what I said about dice. This isn't character creation. I'm talking about while you're playing the game, you may get assigned, you may learn a random background about yourself. You may get assigned a random power or some effect goes on you randomly. The reason I can never figure this out is why this works well on some tabletop games. Like you're playing along and it's like, oh no, turns out I'm the son of a demon. Oh no, it turns out that I can actually shoot fireballs from my nose. But I didn't know I could do that. That's wild. The reason you can't do this in a video game is most of your players will simply make a save game and reload it until they get what they want. So unlike a tabletop, which doesn't have save games ruin a lot of things I want to do. Now, I'm not saying get rid of save games. I'm just saying once you put a pin in the fact that your game has save games, there's a lot of design elements from tabletop games that I could never figure out how to do because people would just go back and use save games to ruin the experience. Maybe one of you guys can figure out how to do it. Maybe it's a form of bargaining with the player going, I'm putting in save games, but please don't use it because you're going to enjoy the negative things because it makes something fun. We'll see. I could never really figure out how to do it, so never did. Anyway, Shearsner, I hope that answered your question.